extraordinary and unpromising neighbourhoods in the search for his remarkable house-agent. Neither of the brothers Grant failed to notice this fact. As the streets grew closer and more crooked, and the roofs lower, and the gutters grosser with mud, a darker curiosity deepened on the brows of Basil, and the figure of Rupert, seen from behind, seemed to fill the street with a gigantic swagger of success. At length, at the end of the fourth or fifth lean grey street in that sterile district, we came suddenly to a halt, the mysterious lieutenant looking once more about him with a sort of sulky desperation. Above a row of shutters and a door, all indescribably dingy in appearance and in size scarce sufficient even for a penny toy shop, ran the inscription, P. Montmorency, House Agent. "This is the office of which I spoke," said Keith in a cutting voice. "Will you wait here a moment, or does your astonishing tenderness about my welfare lead you to wish to overhear everything I have to say to my business adviser?" Rupert's face was white and shaking with excitement. Nothing on earth would have induced him now to have abandoned his prey. "If you'll excuse me," he said, clenching his hands behind his back, "I think I should feel myself justified in—" "Oh, come along in," exploded the lieutenant. He made the same gesture of savage surrender, and he slammed into the office, the rest of us at his heels. P. Montmorency, house agent, was a solitary old gentleman sitting behind a bare brown counter. He had an egg-like head, frog-like jaws, and a grey hairy fringe of aureole around the lower part of his face, the whole combined with a reddish aquiline nose. He wore a shabby black frock-coat, a sort of semi-clerical tie worn at a very unclerical angle, and looked, generally speaking, about as unlike a house-agent as anything could look, short of something like a sandwich man or a Scotch Highlander. We stood inside the room for fully 40 seconds, and the odd old gentleman did not look at us. Neither, to tell the truth, odd as he was, did we look at him. Our eyes were fixed, where his were fixed, upon something that was crawling about on the counter in front of him. It was a ferret. The silence was broken by Rupert Grant. He spoke in that sweet and steely voice which he reserved for great occasions and practised for hours together in his bedroom. He said, "Mr. Montmorency, I think." The old gentleman started, lifted his eyes with a bland bewilderment, picked up the ferret by the neck, stuffed it alive into his trousers pocket, smiled apologetically, and said, "Sir, you are a house agent, are you not?" said Rupert. To the delight of that criminal investigator, Mr. Montmorency's eyes wandered unquietly towards Lieutenant Keith, the only man present that he knew. "A house agent?" cried Rupert again, bringing out the word as if it were burglar. "Yes, oh yes," said the man, with a quavering and almost coquettish smile. "I am a house agent. Yes, oh yes." "Well, I think," said Rupert, with a sardonic sleekness, "that Lieutenant Keith wants to speak to you. We have come in by his request." Lieutenant Keith was lowering gloomily, and now he spoke. "I have come, Mr. Montmorency, about that house of mine." "Yes, sir," said Mr. Montmorency, spreading his fingers on the flat counter. "It's all ready, sir. I've attended to all your suggestions about the... Right," cried Keith, cutting the word short with the startling neatness of a gunshot. "We needn't bother about all that. If you've done what I told you, all right." And he turned sharply towards the door. Mr. Montmorency, house agent, presented a picture of pathos. After stammering a moment, he said, "Excuse me, Mr. Keith, there was another matter about which I wasn't quite sure. I tried to get all the heating apparatus possible under the circumstances, but in winter, at that elevation—" "We can't expect much, eh?" said the lieutenant, cutting in with the same sudden skill. "No, of course not. That's all right, Montmorency. There can't be any more difficulties." And he put his hand on the handle of the door. "I think," said Rupert Grant, with a satanic suavity, "that Mr. Montmorency has something further to say to you. Lieutenant. "Only," said the house-agent in desperation, "what about the birds?" "I beg your pardon," said Rupert in a general blank. "What about the birds?" said the house-agent doggedly. Basil, who had remained throughout the proceedings in a state of Napoleonic calm, which might be more accurately described as a state of Napoleonic stupidity, suddenly lifted his leonine head. "Before you go, Lieutenant Keith," he said, "come now, really, what about the birds?" "I'll take care of them," said Lieutenant Keith, still with his long back turned to us. "They shan't suffer." "Thank you, sir, thank you," cried the incomprehensible house-agent with an air of ecstasy. "You'll excuse my concern, sir. You know I'm wild on wild birds. I'm as wild as any of them on that. Thank you, sir. But there's another thing." The lieutenant, with his back turned to us, exploded with an indescribable laugh and swung round to face us. It was a laugh the purport of which was direct and essential, and yet which one cannot exactly express. As near as it said anything, verbally speaking, it said, "Well, if you must spoil it, you must, but you don't know what you're spoiling." "There is another thing," continued Mr. Montmorency weakly. "Of course, if you don't want to be visited, you'll paint the house green, but—" "Green!" shouted Keith. "Green! Let it be green or nothing. I won't have a house of another colour. Green!" And before we could realise anything, the door had banged between us and the street. Rupert Grant seemed to take a little time to collect himself, but he spoke before the echoes of the door died away. "Your client, Lieutenant Keith, appears somewhat excited," he said. "What is the matter with him? Is he unwell?" "Oh, I should think not," said Mr. Montmorency in some confusion. "The negotiations have been somewhat difficult. The house is rather—" "Green," said Rupert calmly. "That appears to be a very important point. It must be rather green. May I ask you, Mr. Montmorency, before I rejoin my companion outside, whether in your business it is usual to ask for houses by their colour? Do clients write to a house-agent asking for a pink house or a blue house, or, to take another instance, for a green house?" "Only," said Montmorency, trembling, "only to be inconspicuous." Rupert had his ruthless smile. "Can you tell me any place on earth in which a green house would be inconspicuous?" The house-agent was fidgeting nervously in his pocket, slowly drawing out a couple of lizards and leaving them to run on the counter. He said, "No, I can't." "You can't suggest an explanation?" "No," said Montmorency, rising slowly, and yet in such a way as to suggest a sudden situation. "I can't. And may I, as a busy man, be excused if I ask you, gentlemen, if you have any demand to make on me in connection with my business? What kind of house would you desire me to get for you, sir?" He opened his blank blue eyes on Rupert, who seemed for the second staggered. Then he recovered himself with perfect common sense and answered, "I'm sorry, Mr. Montmorency. The fascination of your remarks has unduly delayed us from joining our friend outside. Pray excuse my apparent impertinence." "Not at all, sir," said the house-agent, taking a South American spider idly from his waistcoat pocket and letting it climb up the slope of his desk. "Not at all, sir. I hope you will favour me again." Rupert Grant dashed out of the office in a gust of anger, anxious to face Lieutenant Keith. He was gone. The dull, starlit street was deserted. "What do you say now?" cried Rupert to his brother. His brother said nothing now. We all three strode down the street in silence, Rupert feverish, myself dazed, Basil, to all appearance, merely dull. We walked through grey street after grey street, turning corners, traversing squares, scarcely meeting anyone, except occasional drunken knots of 2 or 3. In one small street, however, the knots of 2 or 3 began abruptly to thicken into knots of 5 or 6, and then into great groups, and then into a crowd. The crowd was stirring very slightly, but anyone with a knowledge of the eternal populace knows that if the outside rim of a crowd stirs ever so slightly, It means that there is madness in the heart and core of the mob,